Welcome to today's webinar, which is on the thesis proposal, the initial compilation and subsequent execution. So it should be interesting to those that are about to submit, but also to those that still will submit. And we hope that as a general learning outcome, you will learn how to compile your thesis research proposal and to subsequently turn it into your first thesis draft. And more specifically, to understand what a thesis proposal is about, to learn about the thesis research proposal conversion process, and how to move from the proposal to a first thesis draft, and more generally what the proposal should cover. And then in the fifth part, to understand the critical elements of the initial thesis proposal, as well as the existing knowledge to leverage into it and how to take it further. And then we will start the group activity where we will stop the recording, and we will look on how to succeed at the triple challenge on how to align the research problem, the research question, and your personal outcome expectations and motivations, which turns often out to be a major barrier for students to progress. Now, what is the thesis proposal about? First of all, it's something in between plan and reality. Now, there's such thing like the thesis proposal and the research plan, and as you envision your research to go, and then there's reality. Means you are juggling in between work, family, and other life commitments, and things will work out often very differently than initially envisioned. And if you are enrolled at a UK university, then you will face a shocking attrition rate of 75%. That means that 3 out of 4 of you will never make it through if you are studying in a UK-based university. In other parts of the world, Australia, it's a similar rate. OECD average is around 52%, but it's a very high rate. So this is something that certainly you would want to avoid. And therefore, it is important to have a clear and realistic proposal that provides you with a structure and with guidance, and that allows you to gradually bring in the boundaries, so to structure your research as you go along. And therefore, you might want to make sure that you understand what a doctorate is all about, and there are a lot of guidelines that are provided. Some are better than others, I would argue. And I found this from Ottawa University, which is pretty precise and good, stating that a research proposal is a roadmap. So unlike project research or projects that you have in the management domain, research projects are usually not executed as planned, but it's a roadmap that provides you with some ideas and at which you will set forward the general context in which the research will take place, and you will put an initial central research question in it. But this is rather to be thought of as a puzzle or a problem that during the research you would want to examine and to understand further, and that will be done in a methodological way, which is envisioned in the proposal. Now, while there is a saying that each thesis and each research is unique, which to some extent also hold valid, there's also a fairly common understanding of what can be considered to be an expectable coverage. You will see here in the left down side, numbered from 1 to 8, titled Statement of the Problem, Background and History, Justification of the Problem, Literature Reviews, Theoretical Framework, Methodology, Research Title, Bibliography. Now this can be expected from a thesis proposal in the one form or the other, but usually the guides point those things out fairly consistently. Now, as just said, the thesis proposal is a roadmap document, and it is a living document. It emerges as your knowledge emerges, as you scan the literature, as you develop a problem understanding, as you engage with others. So this is a very gradual thing to happen. And it is also not a one-on-one, not a chapter, not an extensive literature review, not an opportunity to rehearse. So and it is not a contract that determines what your thesis will demonstrate. You will modify and refine your scope, argument, methods as you go along, and this is absolutely normal and should be understood. Now, often supervisors say, send me the introduction chapter. And once you're done with that, send me the literature review. Now, that sounds very definitive and final. And to some extent, it's also meant like that, because what supervisors usually want is a full first draft of a chapter or of a section, so to read through it and to provide feedback. It's, however, not said or meant to be said, this is final, now work on the next. So this is an important piece of information that you perhaps would want to take into account already at the thesis proposal stage, that yes, the proposal is expected in a sort of final format, but however, once it is received, it will be further evolving over the course of your research. Now, therefore, it's good to get guidance from existing research proposals, but also from faculties on what a thesis proposal should be covered. And there are many nowadays openly available at the web. So just pick from them, but make sure you pick those ones that are focused on the research problem, because if you come across a not so good guide, that will set off your research in a very different format and way, and could well lead to a failure from just the start. For example, here you see at the third row, a solution-focused research questions, which is just looking on how can we make something better. In this case, the dorms more hospitable, while a problem-focused research question will be drafted and crafted in a much different way, looking into the origins. Why don't things work out as expected? Why is something broke, in the simplest term? In this case, why are there no air conditionings in dorms A, B, C, and D? So it's a very precise and specific question that focuses on the thing that isn't as it's expected to be. And if it would be as expected, then the hospital dorms in this example case would be more hospitable. Now, if you still don't know that much about the difference in between solution-focused and problem-focused, the final exercise of today's webinar will run an activity on that, but we also have a dedicated webinar that you might want to replay and see the slides, which is on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing. So if you're still uncertain on what is the difference between problem-focused and solution-focused, please take a look in there. With this, are there any questions for the first part of the webinar? If so, please bring them forward now. Okay, yeah, so let's, okay. That's okay. Perfect. Let's look in the thesis proposal conversion process, which is also important for you to understand already at the proposal stage, because it will tell you why the proposal is written in a certain way and why it does make sense to invest a bit more time into the quality of the initial proposal rather than to get it done. Now, the initial thesis proposal, if well crafted, can be turned into your chapter 1, 2, and 3 of your thesis. That is the introductory chapter, the literature review chapter, and the methodology chapter. This is not to say that it could be turned into full chapters. No, obviously not, because for that it is way too short, but it can provide you with an initial structure and guidance, and that would allow you to establish already some boundaries from day one onwards, and therefore this can pay out the time you invest earlier at a later stage. Now, as this guide here also says, however, often the intentions we state in our proposal turn out differently in reality, and not only different in reality, but they also develop differently, because this is research, and research is by nature open-ended. Likewise, as can be seen from this example, which we had at the earlier part already, if you see the first 4 bullet points, title, statement of the problem, background and history, and justification of the problem, well, could be turned into the introduction chapter of your draft thesis, while point 5 perfectly qualifies for the initial literature review part, and 6 and 7 for the methodology part. And if you go across guides, across different universities, this is, for example, from Stanford University, you will detect the same patterns roughly. So the requirements are fairly common across what can be considered good university programs. And if you don't find those structure, ask yourself why, and read the guides very carefully. And if this is a university where you consider applying to, consider again more careful, and perhaps do some background checks. So if you don't see this type of pattern and structure of what a research proposal should be covered, ask yourself why, and compare them to examples like, for example, this one provided at Stanford University. And we had earlier examples from other universities, which are perhaps not seen to be in the top 10. And also there you will find quite similar requirements. Now, while this is a very old help section that Joseph Levine from Michigan State University provided, it's also a very useful one still today. What I loved in this one, perhaps, is exactly the upfront pointing out, rewrite your proposal into dissertation sections. Now, it is this type of practical guidance that allows us to clearly understand what a doctorate is about and what is expected from a doctoral student and what is the journey of that. Because the doctorate is actually not a really hard thing. It's a quite structured way forward. There's a clear methodology in there. And if you look at the progression of hundreds of students, you could see that they are roughly the same. Now, it's only difficult the first time. Unfortunately, it is that first time where 75% perhaps in the UK and in other countries, perhaps the same rate never will make it through. So look for this type of practical guides and learn from them. This is an advice I might want to provide on this end. But beware, while it says it's perfectly to turn an initial thesis proposal in a draft, yes, but also to understand the other piece of information. Your research is emergent, your knowledge is emergent, and you progress. You will build up knowledge about the problem, about the literature, about related research, about methodologies on a day-to-day basis, because you continue reading. Therefore, what you have in your initial thesis proposal should be rechecked. And this is something that actually throughout the entire doctoral journey is a way of work that should be maintained. As said, it's not chapter 1 is done or chapter 2 is done. This is a constant front and back so that the information is adding up and that the knowledge that is emergent is represented across the entire thesis proposal initially and thesis afterward. So understand this is a one-time off redo situation from the proposal to the first draft of your thesis. Now, another very practical piece of advice here is begin writing with the sections you know the best. Having said that, it's also by the same time a very dangerous advice because usually students put in their energy where it's easiest, and easiest is not where it gets them further. So yes, write with where the knowledge is already more established, but be aware that this also can be a false friend, and so check yourself on that. But we will check later, or we will see later, how the juggling front and back can be achieved and what are the motivations in there. Now, how do we get from a research proposal to a draft thesis? At the left side, we see the proposal stage, which is where you put your thesis proposal together and where you state the problem as you perceive it at that point in time. Likewise, the research question will mainly focus on what is not clear or not understood for most of the cases. You will also bring in who was looking at that earlier and how they have been looking at it, what methods they have been using in the key literature and related studies, and which for that reason you would consider to adopt for your study. So this is not, understand there's a difference in between copy-paste, which should be avoided, but drawing on related studies is something research works over state of the art, right? If it's just the application of a method that is well known and understood, obviously that is not doctoral level research. However, if you draw on the state of the art, on the related studies, then you work exactly over the edge of knowledge, and you build on it. So then comes what sort of data should be collected and from where. Again, the related studies and key literature will guide you on that. And how will the data be analyzed? And what are the expected outcomes of the research? Now, this is the most dangerous part, perhaps, of the thesis proposal, because it asks you to gamble of what the research will produce, which is something you won't be able to state certain at this point in time. And you perhaps not even would want to do so. And we will see later why. So once you have it covered on the left hand, once you turn it into the thesis, once the research starts, you will see that the problem statement will change in terms of problem as perceived, as problem in accordance to the data and findings that you collect and that you start to analyze. And we will now look into this, how that looks in a more structured way. Now, exactly, the key literature and related study can guide you initially. And then once you go ahead, you will start to collect data and you will start to analyze them and you will start relating them to the literature. And this will change the way you understand the problem. It will change the way you frame the research question. It will point you to other relevant literature sources, and it will point you to additional methodologies that you might want to apply. And collecting data and analyzing findings will also provide you with some routine. As you go ahead, you will understand what you do good, what others do better, and where you can improve. So this is, again, also evolution on that side. So this will shape the data and findings, potentially can shape your research and how you can proceed. What will not guide you, however, but rather will misdirect you, and we come there to the outcome expectations, is everything that students usually love doing because it's exciting, it's easy, they can put in ideas, creativities, there are opportunities to be harnessed. Doing things out of the blue is also something that is very often seen, but it's nothing that should be done because you're expected to work over related studies. Yeah. And the solutions, the greatness and the optimal outcomes and shiny, nice ideation is also very often driving the research. And all of that can lead to the great struggle. And we will look into this in the final activity. So as we are there, and as already called out earlier, research is not linear. The thesis proposal and the final thesis read linear. Yes, that's true, but that's about it. Everything else is a front and back juggling. And therefore, that earlier tip from Levensine, start writing where you hold the knowledge. Yes, that holds valid to some degree, but again, don't work over the easiness. Elsewise, you risk ending up in somewhere here or here. And this is nothing where you want to be. I'm certain about that. Now, before we come into the fourth part, are there any questions? As said, you will get time to also ask off-the-record questions once we come into the group activity. So then let's look at what the proposal should cover and how that later will be translated into the thesis. Now, I put for each of the steps we've been going through earlier a number of examples out. Now, for the research case of we experienced a high fluctuation rate in the accounting department, then a problem statement might be, what is the issue? Likewise, the marketing material is not reaching the customers. This is the problem as perceived. So what is the issue? The marketing material is not suitable. What sales were declining? The sales were declining by 20% in the last quarter. So what is the issue in here? Sales are declining by 20%. So as you can see, the problem statement is pretty well derived from how you understand the issue. Now, what is not clear understood, the research question is equally derived from the problem statement. If the case is we experience a high fluctuation rate in the accounting department, then an obvious research question, certainly not the only, but an obvious one, would be why is there a high fluctuation rate? Likewise, for the marketing material case that is not reaching the customers, an obvious research question would be why is someone developing unsuitable marketing material? So the why question, as you can see, is a very inherent question to be asked if something is not understood. Obviously, as more we understand about the situation, as more precise we can ask other questions like what is happening here? Why is or how is that happening? Who is doing that actually? So as more as the knowledge emerges, as more as a problem becomes understood, as more the research question will change. And for the last case, sales were declining by 20%. Why were sales declining by 20%? So the questions can be clearly derived and you can control yourself if there is a logic and match behind. If we come to the key literature sources and related studies, like who was looking at this earlier, again, the same three examples. Why is there a high fluctuation rate? Where is the fluctuation happening? And is this only happening to us? Is this known from the literature to happen for exactly the same situation that you are looking at or dealing with? So this is a quite obvious thing to look for in the literature. Why is someone developing unsuitable marketing material? Is this a communication issue? Or is it about ignorance of people working there? Or is it just about wrong perceptions in those that receive the marketing materials? Those are equally literature sources that we might want to consult. And for the third case, why were sales declined by 20% in the last quarter? Again, we can check, is this only happening to us? Were there any changes in the last quarter? So we can work over the known and based upon that identify literature sources. And this will drive our research further and provide us with further boundaries. Now, who was looking at this earlier and how? Once it comes to the methodology, you will look at what methods did previous study use, what worked out well and what did not. So you can build on that and also leverage that into your research. What data did the studies gathered and from what sources? And could such methods be adopted for my research too? Now, the point here is that often the literature is consulted rather with the conclusion focus. Therefore, the sources and the data analysis and so forth are not considered once it comes to drawing on such previous studies. And this obviously then will mean you lose out of this possibility of understanding what has been done before and how could that support my own research. And are those studies suitable to answer the questions that my research is asking? And have those studies provided answers already to the questions that my research is asking? And if so, what is my motivation to ask the questions again? So this is something that once you go through related studies, you also can then use as a guiding tool to see, okay, what is already known here, what is answered, and what for my case needs to be re-asked. And what does it take to use such methods, and would there be any training needed to make use of such methods? This is something that individually needs to be evaluated, whether or not those methods seem to be workable to you, or if there's some knowledge that and skills that still need to be trained. Likewise, once you move from proposal to thesis development, what data should be collected and from where? What were the data sources that earlier studies looked at, and would these be relevant to this research? This can guide you in your research execution. Obviously, you won't have that knowledge at the thesis proposal stage. Therefore, as you go along, this additional knowledge will come in and also should be considered once it comes to the data collection and analysis. How do I collect my data from where? So you get more precise as you go through the process. To whom does that problem apparently relate to? In particular to social science studies, this is of importance. What are the stakeholders that need to be engaged? What can be observed by me, but also by those stakeholders? And what data is already readily available, and what does it tell me about the problem? And what do I need to collect myself? what are the analysis tools that earlier studies used and how did they work out? What does it take to use such analysis tools? And would there be training needed? So again, once it comes into the thesis stage, the initial knowledge would become more precise, and therefore you will better understand what analysis tools are really available and what perhaps still needs to be trained. And I think this is also very different to master level studies, that for the doctoral case, you will be much more asked to take initiative of your own training and to understand your own training needs. And for the conclusions, what are the expected outcomes of the research? Is the research based by my expected outcomes, or is it geared towards problem examination? What happens if the expected outcomes cannot be met? Does the research question potentially result in actionable knowledge or just generate knowledge that will contribute to the literature? Now, in the fifth part, we will look into understanding the critical elements of the thesis proposal and how to leverage the knowledge further. The leverage of existing knowledge into the first draft will start, as we earlier saw, with a problem in issue statements, a research question, and the literature. But then, as soon as you are there, you will continue to work out the different problem domains. You will collect data and findings will emerge, and that will guide your research further. And that then will allow you to revise the initial problem and issue statement to be more precise, to work it out further. And the research question will be sharpening, they become more clear, and this is a gradual process. And what always is advisable at that point in time is to keep a record on how things evolve, which will allow you to clearly understand what was the initial knowledge, what was the initial envisioning of the methodology, and how did things evolve over time, and how all of that then shall be written up in your thesis. And this then will allow you to start mirroring out your thesis structure, so to assure that the information is aligning across the entire thesis document. And as you can see here, for example, if you work over problem domains, and those words depend on exactly the type of research that you are carrying out. Do we talk here about problem domain? Do we talk about problem fields? Are that areas? That will very much depend on the specific research fields that you're in. And in any case, what matters here is the preciseness and to keep things aligned throughout the thesis, because that will help you to build up and bring up the narrative as exactly seen in this example. And ultimately, this ideally would lead to a clear understanding on how the different parts of the thesis are adding up. In this case here, we used color highlighting to see, okay, this section chapter relates to this one and this one and this one. So you can use easy tools to be guided in your research. And observe your research saturating from the initial research questions that are perhaps more open and broad, like what is happening here, why is this not working, to the more precise ones, what are the questions that this research has actually answered, what can be learned from the data I've been collecting, and therefore the final research questions will perhaps put the direction of how you write up the thesis in a very different way to how you initially envisioned that. And again, you can learn from the data, and if you listen to your data carefully and the analysis is good, then you clearly can say and build the question based upon what the data is telling you. Now, if this is a case study, what is the research question? If this is the answer, what is the question, is a panel game from BBC. And From a given answer, panelists rather comically guess the question. In one episode, the panel was given the answer cheese, wine, and rubbish, to which one panelist answered as being a comment. What are 3 words best describing France? So if you understand your data or the way you interpret your data will also impacting the way that you frame your research question. And up till a very end point where you will be able to turn a really structured way out on how your thesis is relating to each other. So this is a journey from the initial thesis proposal up to the very end point. And things only will gradually turn out and they will emerge and evolve further. But as more as you take stock and control of your past developments, as better you will be guided for the future. And as more you work on the preciseness, as better you will be able to translate that into the written parts of your thesis. Now, that you understand all of that, I think you might want to get on with your research and get your first draft together. If you think you would want some further training on working this out, please check out our advanced training course on issue identification, problematizing and research question framing. We have this course, like all of our courses, in 3 formats. In the basic version, it's available for free self-study with peer support. You can check it out without any risk. And we are having another course in the pipeline, which focuses exactly on developing your doctoral thesis research proposal. And we expect to release that within the next months. So stay informed and come back if you consider this to be a training area that you would like to look into. With this, we come into the group activity, and this is the point in time where Jack will stop the recording and where we have an off-the-record discussion option. So Jack, might I ask you